Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to the closing days of the war for BADAB. After the failed Loyalist invasion of the Piraeus system and the tyrant's last desperate gamble to crush Loyalist resistance for decades to come, a sense of strange irregularity had settled on both parts of the conflict, with neither quite knowing where it stood vis-a-vis the other. From where the Loyalists stood, they had amassed a majestic fleet formation, the majority of their void-born firepower, consisting of dozens of squadrons of frigates and destroyers, escorting in 6 Imperial Navy cruisers, 2 battle barges, 4 strike cruisers, and the Retribution-class battleship Throne of Blood. It was considered a near unstoppable formation, for whom the Piraeus system was a mere precursor, a beachhead, to launch an invasion against the heart of secessionist space, the BADAB system. And along with the void-born elements came, of course, 6 full companies of the God Emperor's chosen Astartes, from the Exorcists and the Red Scorpions chapter. It was a force intended to end a war, and yet, never mind making it to the BADAB system, it hadn't even gotten out of Piraeus and had indeed failed to even seize that system. Even worse, Piraeus had been a trap laid by the tyrant, who had lured in and slaughtered fully half of the Space Marine strike force, and crippled or destroyed the majority of the Imperial Navy assets. Those who were still void-capable would require years of extensive repair, maintenance, and refits before returning to full service. And lest we forget, in this ongoing war between angels and warships, tens of thousands of Imperial Guard personnel were also vaporized in an instant as their troop transports were destroyed high above the skies of Piraeus 5. And that is to say nothing about the potential scenario so narrowly avoided, were it not for the heroic sacrifice of the cruiser Gauntlet of Aegis. The secessionist raiding ships would have dug even deeper into the Loyalists' transport lines. Were it not for the cruiser plowing suicidally into the secessionists' warships, they may have very well gutted the entirety of the troop transport capability of the Loyalist fleet, and even worse, may have interfered or outright halted Vice Admiral Kagawa's plan to retreat and reorganize, the maneuver that eventually saved the Loyalist fleet from complete annihilation. And let us also not forget the heroic actions of the Exorcist strike cruiser, the Redeemer, that risked itself going into extreme low orbit above the lunar colonies to evacuate the Loyalist Astartes engaged with an overwhelming force of astral claws. As far as the majority of the command crew back on Vengeance Station were concerned, the Loyalists had come within a felon's whisker of losing 6 companies of Space Marines alongside the most powerful fleet formation in the entire autonomous zone. That is a hefty wake-up call delivered by an enemy whom the Loyalists had considered all but defeated. There were now those within the Loyalist command structure that argued that the offensive towards BADAB should be cancelled completely. Instead, the BADAB system should be blockaded. All stable warp routes in and out should be brought under Imperial control and heavily guarded with Navy assets, allowing the tyrant and his now minuscule empire of 7 worlds, out of which only 1 was truly habitable, to wither and die on the vine, rather than risk another potential defeat, the cost of which could hardly even be imagined. After all, what was there really to be gained by invading BADAB Primaris now? The tyrant's fleet was much reduced, his ability to build new warships non-existent. What damage could the tyrant truly do from a single populated hive world? And was the tyrant even still alive? Surely the point-blank range devastation rained down on the lunar colony by the Redeemer must have killed the tyrant as well. Why risk tens of thousands of further Imperial lives in the pursuit of a single hive world and the now assuredly leaderless astral claws? But the discussion was brought to a swift end as the still bleeding, near mortally wounded Carab Cullen stormed into the conference room and declared that no, the tyrant was most assuredly not dead, and his rebellion could not be allowed to fester for a moment longer. The war had to be brought to a conclusive end, no matter the cost. On the other side of the divide, the tyrant had considerably less disagreement in his camp, due largely to the fact that he did not tolerate it in the slightest. But their position was no less precarious. The tyrant had bet everything on destroying a large portion of the Loyalists' forces in the Piraeus system, and he had failed. With the failure also came the loss of the Seraph of Judgment, the last major capital-class vessel in his navy, the last warship that could possibly have challenged the likes of the Throne of Blood of the Raptorus Rex. From now on and out, the Loyalists did not merely have theoretical void dominance, it was an absolutely assured certainty of any engagement. This in turn led, as mentioned last time, to the tyrant withdrawing all forces from the outer BADAB sector, pulling them all into the inner BADAB system, and specifically to the Ring of Steel. This was now his last and only defense. Perhaps the tyrant and some of his command staff still hoped that maybe the Loyalists would back off, that the events of Piraeus had shaken them, that the Ring of Steel might be viewed as too great a risk to engage straight on. But after having locked weapons with Carab Cullen personally, I doubt the tyrant had much faith in such hopeful ideas. Nevertheless, the ring remained an imposing obstacle. The most recent Loyalist documentation on its prowess cited at least 5 star forts in constant orbit near the outer edges of the system. These platforms were in turn defended by multiple vast overlapping minefields of many different types, yields, and specializations. Everything from disabling plasma webcasters for smaller escorts and frigates to assassin mines, whose blast yields would be able to split even the heaviest capital vessel in half. The minefields alone would be enough to reduce most armadas trying to force passage through them to stellar debris. And if the objective was to seize BADAB Primaris, then this Ring of Steel would be further supported by the local fleet element, whatever remained of the wider Maelstrom Squadron, Astral Claw's Void Presence, and, of course, perhaps most significant of all, the Inviolate Pattern Star Fortress in high orbit above BADAB Primaris, the Fortress Monastery of the Warders chapters, now the Monastery of the Astral Claws alone. As eager as Carab Khan was to end the conflict, he would not be able to do so without at least as sizable a force as the one he had squandered at Piraeus. And so, for the next full year or so, the BADAB conflict entered into an unusual state that would become known as the Silent War, as both parties seemed more interested in avoiding any further losses than crushing the other. There were skirmishes here and there, minor engagements on the surface of half-remembered, barely named planets on the edges of all known maps. There were the occasional engagement in the void, with ships taking extreme-range potshots at one another. Most of these were so insignificant, they never even made it into the logbooks of the units or vessels responsible. The Loyalists were too busy organizing another armada, reinforcing the Red Scorpions and the Exorcists, bringing in further chapters, if possible, and creating an airtight containment around the remaining secessionist territories, which swiftly proved to not be quite so airtight at all. With both the Scorpions and the Exorcists more or less out of the fight, containment procedures were left almost entirely to the Minotaurs and the Sons of Medusa. The Carcharodons were still sharking about, but they were not the kind of chapter to take to orders particularly well. Particularly not orders to go sit somewhere quietly and not cause any trouble. Meanwhile, the secessionists were clearly having some internal drama of their own, as seemingly small splinter elements, a small ship here, a small group there, would break out of the containment seemingly without any directives from the tyrant. Instead of engaging loyalist trade lines or logistical services, they would instead seek to vanish into the Maelstrom Warpstorm zone. Presumably, these were some sort of deserters fleeing the tyrant's now seemingly inevitable doom. As long as Lufthuron had had an enemy to point them against, he had managed to maintain the cohesion of his claws quite well. But now, after nearly a year of quiet, seemingly many captains and the leaders of the newly organized war bands thought that they might just be better off by themselves. At first, this would appear to be good news. The tyrant was bleeding fighting strength, without the loyalists needing to do anything. Perhaps the more cautious elements at Vengeance Station had been right all along. Sequester the tyrant and his remaining men for long enough, and they will all bleed away into the void. The problem, however, as immediately pointed out by Carab Khan and Captain Mirasan, was that these were Adeptus Astartes, heretics, traitors, the lowest of the low to be sure, but still Space Marines. If they were allowed to scatter throughout the autonomous zone and the Maelstrom Warpstorm, along with vessels, supplies, arms, and armor, they would become a niggling threat wearing away at the stability of the autonomous zone for decades and possibly centuries. Perhaps, Carab Cullen might have said in one of the countless meetings being had around the situation, the rest of the Imperial forces had forgotten why they were here in the first place. The autonomous zone was not simply to be left behind as some backwater collection of worlds, some outlaw district, some mere autonomous zone anymore. It was to become a part of the Imperium again. Its vital resources were needed now more than ever after decades of starvation for many nearby Forge worlds. And the situation was not growing any more stable either, he reminded them. The countless worlds seemingly liberated by the Loyalist forces, well, Many of them did not agree as to the meaning of the term liberation. Many would prefer perhaps occupation, by a hostile force at that. Were it not for the deployment of countless millions of Imperial Guard reserve troops throughout the various worlds, most of them would quickly descend into either outright chaotic anarchy or yet further movements of localized independence. The Imperium had moved in to reclaim the autonomous zone, and once it had done so now in name, in military force, the Imperium's dominance was nothing more than a line on a piece of paper, a technicality enforced only by the lasgun and the bayonet. It was beginning to cost more to police the autonomous zone than it was worth, and if you were to add on a few hundred rampant and masterless space marines to the mix, well, frankly, you would have been better off simply leaving the tyrant in power to begin with. And speaking of the devil, whilst everyone else was too scared to move, the tyrant had been engaging in precisely what everyone had suspected him to do. After Piraeus, the remaining forces had been withdrawn to the BADAB system itself. But the ambition of the tyrant's withdrawal was beyond the imagination of the loyalists. He had not merely withdrawn Tyrant's legion forces and the remainder of the Astral Claws, he had begun to dismantle entire defense networks. Las batteries, torpedo silos, orbital defenses, and permacrete constructs were all being dragged from their foundations of worlds like Isin and Acabulus and brought full-scale, piece by piece, to the BADAB system. If there was any doubt about the strength of the Ring of Steel initially, it could now be all but guaranteed that any loyalist data would provide nothing more than a false sense of security. Attempts were, of course, made to interdict these convoys, but the loyalists were so badly scattered, so disunited in terms of strategy and leadership, with Karab Cullen still laying stricken and wounded, a remarkable thing for an Adeptus Astartes as well, to still have wounds that refused to close weeks and months after his duel. There were even whispers amongst the inquisitorial elements that surely the tyrant's weapons could not be entirely off this world any longer. Suffice to say, without Karab Cullen's constant, strong hand on the levers of power, the loyalists were unable to interdict the vast majority of these convoys. Something drastic was going to have to be done. And so, finally recovered from his wound, Lord Militant Karab Cullen declared that a full council of war would be held on Ventran Station in the Viania system to determine precisely what measures needed to be taken, and if those measures were possible with the current strength of the loyalist troops, or if yet further chapters and allies needed to be called upon. Though, on that note, the Legate Inquisitor had already come up with some ideas. The council was held, and the summons was sent out to all loyalist commanders. Representatives of the Imperial Guard and the Imperial Navy were of course present, as was Karab Cullen, and representatives from the Salamanders, Minotaurs, Exorcists, Carcharodons, and the Sons of Medusa. And a controversial inclusion was also Stibor Lazarek of the Firehawks, who had for the last few years been saddled with rear line patrol and garrison duties. Not because anyone doubted their ability or willingness to fight, but because they had such a nasty habit of getting on everybody else's nerves. and Cullen could hardly afford another chapter up and quitting on him after they didn't get along with their allies. That, of course, went for the Carcharodons as well, who were driven off the Fire Angels, but once more, Cullen certainly did not have the luxury to chase off one of his largest and most intact allies. But the inclusion of Stebo Lazarek paled in comparison to John Dye's Frey's guest. The Magos of the Angstrom System's Forge Worlds. The very same who had attacked Loyalist and Secessionist forces indiscriminately during the Angstrom incident, and had threatened and indeed carried out multiple subsequent raids against Loyalist space, planets, and supply columns in the wake of that incident. When the chapter master of the Red Scorpions inquired at what price this latest addition to their merry little alliance had come at, the usually vociferous Legate Inquisitor fell suspiciously silent, indicating to me that the Archmagos had secured himself a princely price indeed for his assistance, his warships, his Skitari legions, and most importantly of all, Legio Crucius, the Titan Legion stationed on Angstrom, led by the Warlord-class Titan Hell's Daughter and its High Principe Cadmon Crom. And to be fair to the Legate Inquisitor, considering the battle in front of the Loyalist forces would be an assault upon an incredibly heavily entrenched and fortified system, the addition of a Warlord Titan, several Reavers, and a dozen Warhounds was worth almost any price. Though I imagine there were several within the Loyalist ranks that were not at all overjoyed to see the mechanical form of the Archmagos partake in their strategy meetings. A conclave, by the way, that quickly became a self-congratulatory triumph for the Legate Inquisitor. He and Carab Cullen had long competed for influence over the Council, and, in all due likelihood, for final credit of the war's outcome. The Legate Inquisitor could inform the rest of the Conclave that sadly, no further Imperial Guard or Imperial Navy reinforcements could be forthcoming. The latest losses had been too severe, and the demands of the Imperium for vessels and warriors elsewhere were growing steadily greater. The BADAB conflict would have to be brought to a close as quickly as possible with whatever forces were available, as the Imperium could simply not afford any further measures for a war that should already have been ended. But fear not, for the God Emperor's most holy Inquisition provides. Not only have they brought the Archmagus of the Angstrom system to the Loyalist aid, with his warships, his Skitari, and his Titans, but he had also gotten the full support of yet another full chapter of the Adeptus Astartes. The Star Phantoms were even now vectoring towards the Autonomous Zone in full chapter strength to join their powers to the Loyalists. Ah yes, the Star Phantoms. Another dark chapter, who tended to take their instructions from a certain group of individuals with stylized eyes around their necks. Just the kind of news Carab Cullen had undoubtedly been waiting for, but again, whilst he was technically the Lord Militant, his position was slowly but surely being resigned more and more to that of a mere figurehead. and the conclave ended with a newly formed plan of action. First and foremost, Stibor Lazarek, of all people, would lead the new invasion of the Piraeus system, with the Inquisition's blessing to take any and all actions necessary to secure it in the name of the God Emperor. Once that was done, instead of a rapid move towards BADAB itself, the Loyalists would spread out. The Exorcists, Sons of Medusa, and the Carcharodons, now redeployed, would spread out through the BADAB sector and impose an iron lockdown on the BADAB system itself. By the way, as a quick little aside, the sector was a gathering of many solar systems, whereas the BADAB system, of course, was the system in which BADAB Primaris itself lay. In this way, further reinforcements that might stream to the aid of the tyrant or additional materiel could be halted, and the future siege could be made easier. There were undoubtedly more than a few minds in the room that thought to themselves that time had long since passed, and this was little more than a political maneuver of yet further self-aggrandizement, but at this particular tipping point of power and influence, no one felt the need to speak these opinions out loud. Oh, and whilst this was all going on, of course, the remainder of the Loyalist forces would be gathering for the last final assault towards BADAB Primaris itself. And as to the redeployment of the Carcharodons, who had been busy in the Endymion cluster dealing with the last handful of remnants of the Mantis Warriors, well, the Mantis Warriors had surrendered themselves to the Imperial Legate's authority, but well, that was mostly Carab Cullen's accomplishment to have dispatched the Carcharodons in the first place, so let us not dwell too long on this irrelevant point, shall we? And instead, get back to patting the Legate Inquisitor on the back. And hey, in all due technicality, his plan was sound enough. It was merely to move in from all directions, take over the planets that had already been abandoned by the tyrant, and then leave the task of assaulting BADAB Primaris to Carab Cullen. A tactic that had already proven remarkably effective at Piraeus. If it succeeds, well, look at all of these new military forces provided by the Inquisition. Clearly, they've had a firm stake in this victory. And if it fails, local leadership, you know? What can you do? Good help is damnably hard to find. Say what you will about the Legate Inquisitor, but I like the way he thinks. And so it went. The Raptorus Rex, with Stibor Lazarek aboard, slammed home into the Piraeus system, not at the outer edges, but near the inner envelope of the system, alongside a large Firehawks and Imperial fleet, ready to crush whatever resistance remained. Of which, of course, there was none. The tyrant had long since evacuated the system, and taken virtually all of its defenses along with him, even the charred and damaged hulks of the system patrol crafts and frigates and destroyers. The only remaining secessionist elements, quote-unquote, that remained, were those on Yarrow Station, the industrialized world that the Imperial Navy had failed to seize during the previous invasion. And by elements, by the way, I mean the starving civilian populace left behind by the Astral Claws after they had essentially raided the planet, taking all the industrial machinery, the foodstuff, the munitions, the supplies, the weaponry, all of it, and carting it off to BADAB. The Raptorus Rex hove into low orbit above the defenseless planet and engaged the remaining secessionist elements on the orders of Stibor Lazarek and the blessing of the God Emperor's most holy Inquisition. scouring the last traitorous enemy troops from the Piraeus system. A glorious victory indeed, carried out at precisely 0 Imperial casualties. A compliance worthy of a war master. Meanwhile, there were others hunting down the last few little problematic leads. Captain Mirasan of the Salamanders had a conundrum on his mind now ever since the executioners had de facto saved him and his crew from the heretical perditions of the astral claws during the so-called Red Hour. After which, the executioners had by and large disengaged themselves from loyalist targets and stopped actively seeking out and persecuting them in the void of space, whilst also attacking Astral Claw's outlier garrisons and stations. Despite this, however, Karab Cullen and the loyalist hands were tied. The Triumvirate maintained that the executioners, at least those who were still at large in the autonomous zone, were traitors on equal lines along the astral claws. Those who had remained on their homeworld of Stygia Aquilon were currently under investigation but presumed to be uninvolved. At least according to their own testimony and the fact that they had seemingly not left their twin homeworlds since the beginning of the BADAB conflict. This was not enough, however, for those who had been preyed upon by the executioners previously. The Sons of Medusa had not forgiven their losses at the executioners' hands, and had found an odd form of common ground with the unlikeliest of chapters, the Carcharodons. If I were to offer an hypothesis here, the Carcharodons were badly undersupplied, and whatever materials they may have raided from outlying secessionist systems, they would still have lacked the processing facilities to turn them into the high-grade weapons, armor, and supplies normally employed by the Adeptus Astartes. But being who they were, the Sons of Medusa would have possessed these things in abundance. It would not at all surprise me if the two had struck some form of a bargain. Hey, space sharks, why don't you go over here and help us maul these secessionist traitors, and in return, we'll give you weapons, we'll give you armor, we'll give you all the war gear you require to continue to turn the void red in your wake. I hardly imagine the Carcharodons would have needed to be asked twice, to be honest. But this alliance had caused Pellas Mirasan a little bit of worry. They had proven remarkably effective at chasing down the executioners, and it now seemed they may have isolated them to only one small area of space. The executioners were at the end of their rope and might very well be facing extinction soon. And with the debt of honor owed to the executioners by the Salamanders, this was something that Mirasan was eager to avoid. Fortunately for him, a Vanguard-class cruiser, the Obsidii, had recently arrived along with another 50 Salamanders' battle brothers. A force quickly requisitioned by Pellas Mirasan, who headed out into the area where the executioners were expected to be held up. He didn't have a whole lot in the way of a plan, beyond arriving in the area and signaling his own presence and intent, hoping that the executioners would recognize him from their actions against the Astral Claws, and at the very least be willing to talk. It turned out that the Guard Emperor had a more expedient plan in mind, as the Obsidii arrived just in the nick of time. two executioners' battle barges, the Phaeton's Wrath and the infamous Night Hag, were in the process of hunting down and destroying two damaged Sons of Medusa strike cruisers in the middle of an asteroid field. The Sons of Medusa had been lured into the field, thinking they were about to fall upon the unsuspecting base of the executioners. It had, in reality, been a trap, a false beacon placed there to lure out anyone foolish enough to pursue the executioners. And they were just about to live up to their name, as Pellas Myrsan ordered the Obsidii to move straight into the lines of fire between the two warring factions and block their shots, whilst broadcasting on all available frequencies their identity and their intentions. A few tense hours passed, and in fact it was the Sons of Medusa that came closest to firing upon the Obsidii, furious that they had been caught out like this and desperate for any chance of vengeance against the executioners. But Pellas Myrsan eventually managed to talk them out of their doomed actions, and got into a private conversation with Thulsa Cain of the executioners, promising him safe passage and conduct to the Loyalist command station, where he would be given a private audience with Carab Cullen, and hopefully the entire war could then be settled, at least the portion between the executioners and the Loyalists. Still doubtful, but willing to honor Pellas Myrsan with his compliance, Thulsa Cain agreed, so long as the salamanders would stay near the executioners' vessels at all time, and that they were to be escorted in personally under the salamanders' flag of truce. Hardly an unreasonable request, and so it was. The executioner's Night Hag, with Cain aboard it, would follow Pellas Myrsan's Obsidia all the way back to Vention Station, and they were shadowed every step of that way by Carcharodon's and Sons of Medusa warships, though they did not attack. The Salamander's reputations as good guys protecting them once more. Upon finally arriving at Vention Station, there was another tense moment or two, as practically everyone there simply wanted to blast the Night Hag into smithereens, and hell be to honor. But Carab Cullen managed to talk them down. If blood was shed dishonorably now, not only would the executioners turn again into enemies, but in all due likelihood, the remaining executioners stationed on Stygia Aquilon would probably no longer be quite so eager to maintain their self-imposed house arrest. As it were, Thulsa Cain, trusting in the word of Pellas Myrsan, came aboard Vention Station for his audience with Carab Cullen. With Myrsan vouching for his honor, Cullen was obliged to offer amnesty and forgiveness to the executioners, though he did have a few conditions. First and foremost, the executioners were to leave the autonomous zone now and forever. The bulk of the remaining executioners would then travel back to their homeworlds of Stygia Aquilon, where they would join their brothers in de facto house arrest under supervision until the end of the war. As a guarantee for their compliance, Thulsa Cain and his honor guard would be dispatched to Nocturne, where they would stay under guard by the Salamanders, who would act as secondary guarantors for the treaty, and any breach of the treaty by the executioners would be the Salamanders' responsibility, and their chapter would then need to hunt down the executioners and bring them to justice. And finally, once the war was over, the executioners chapter in its entirety would be presented before a consistorial court of inquiry, where their responsibility in the war, their reasons for joining, and any potential punishment would be meted out. In return for this, BADAB Colon would promise that it would not be an inquisitorial court, which would hopefully save the executioners from any potential politicking. A very wise move indeed. Legate Inquisitor Jarndyce Frayne had scored a significant victory in the realms of politics with the recent War Council. But now BADAB Cullen had gotten the executioners to surrender, agree to terms, and even a trial. That was enough of an upset to potentially make a man like Jarndyce Frayne bear a bit of a grudge towards a certain chapter. With Captain Mirasan's debt of honor repaid, all that now remained was to lean back and wait for the arrival of the Star Phantoms chapter to spearhead the assault into the BADAB system, and the arrival of the Angstrom allies in the form of the Titans of Legio Crucius. The last battle of the BADAB War is just ahead of us. But until then, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for listening, and I hope to see you all again soon. Until then, have a good day.